So welcome to the session on the geography of discontent. That is really a big topic that has received a lot of attention in the last very few years. And we have three fantastic presenters. We have first Luis Dastra, that is head of economic analysis in the European Commission. And then we have a bit of a change of an order, Nicola Pontarollo, University of Brescia, Italy. And then Maria Caichina, which is a PhD student, University of Verona, Italy. So you can see that the discontent has attracted particular attention on my own country. By the way, I'm Simona Iammarino, London School of Economics, but Italian. And so we will use a lot the example of Italy that recently, in fact, has expressed its discontent for sure. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Luis for the first presentation, 20 minutes, more or less, okay? I mean, we are flexible. It's a small session, but very, very good. And then we'll have a bit of discussion, okay? The floor is yours, Luis.
See if this works. Yeah, it does. Amazing. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about a number of papers that we have already published, but also in particular about a new paper Andres and I are working on. So we want to look at EU discontent. So by that, we mean people voting for parties that are skeptical or anti-EU integration. And I want to talk a little bit about the first about how this has changed over time. And I want to highlight here the fact that trust in the EU has taken a big hit after the financial and economic crisis in 2008. You can see that the majority of the adult population in the EU says they tend not to trust the EU, which is a bit worrying, especially if you work for the EU, but even also in general. And now I'm very happy to report 10 years later, trust has just outperformed distrust, but we'll see how that trend continues. But this overall trend is not reflected in political voting as of yet. If anything, it's getting worse. So we have looked at the share of votes in national parliamentary elections going to parties that are either moderately opposed or strongly opposed to EU integration. And so, you know, we had a very happy period there in the early 2000s where almost nobody thought that it was a good idea to vote against EU integration. Then here you've got the financial economic crisis and bang, they basically doubled. Then 2016, we have the Brexit referendum. We're slowly starting to understand what it means to leave the EU. Some people believe there's plenty of opportunities, but I also would add that there are plenty of drawbacks. I'm not sure the opportunities are that much better, but after a long period, we still see an increase in moderate opposition, and more recently, and the Italian elections didn't help, we see an increase in even strong opposition to EU integration. So we might want to think about this, right? So I don't myself decide who's against the EU. We have the Chapel Hill Expert Survey who does that. And so we use these categories from there. They have multiple political experts judging every party. So this is, too bad that you can't read I made this graph too big, but you can kind of guess, right? So you can see Hungary on the far left and Italy next to it with the highest current vote of moderate Euroscepticism, and they're both above 50%, right? That's the majority of votes going to a party that's at least somewhat against EU integration. And here you can see the EU. 1 second. Oh, thank you for fixing it. Yes, that's. So you can see Hungary, Italy, France, Poland, the Netherlands, Sweden, Belgium, and Slovakia as the countries who have the highest share of moderate anti-European voting more recently. So that is mixture, North and South, East and West, recent members, founding members. So it's really quite worrying, right? And here you can see how this has gone up, and we're really at a high point now. Next slide, please. I have a tendency to maximize my maps and my graphs to really use every edge of the screen, and now I'm realizing there's a cost to doing that. But so, you know, moderate skepticism, over 25% of EU votes. So in the last 4 years, 1/4 of votes went to a moderately Eurosceptic party. If you look at stronger Euroscepticism, you'll see that we're up above 13%. Yeah, but one back. Oh yeah, okay, yes, I can do it myself. Ha, perfect. And so here you can see we're about 13%, and there we go. And you can see that in terms of strong Euroscepticism, Italy, and we'll hear more about that later, is really the number one in the EU right now. And this is EU 27, so we don't have the UK there anymore. I mean, I think this is genuinely worrying, and obviously we want to understand what is driving this. I don't seem to be able to. No. Yes. Okay. So here are the maps. They're color coded. Strong opposition, moderate opposition. Red is above the EU average, and so you can see, for example, for the strong opposition in Italy, you can see a north-south divide, and then moderate opposition, you can see very high levels in Hungary and Poland. But Poland, you know, you can see a difference between East and West, and the cities performing quite different. So you see substantial differences there, and also in Germany, both for the strong and the moderate opposition, you can see a big difference between the regions that used to be part of former Eastern Germany and the rest of Germany. So we want to highlight that the things that we'll take into account in this analysis is also turnout. Low turnout tends to boost the anti-European vote share. We also need to consider how many of these votes have actually been coded by Chapel Hill. Some of the countries have a lot of small parties which aren't coded. We're working on that. We're hoping to get the numbers up a little bit in Bulgaria and in Slovenia. But then we'll do an analysis, and these are the things we want to test. So a whole bunch of indicators, but the most important one I want to highlight is the development trap. This is where we check if regions have been growing particularly slowly, and then seeing how that translates into electoral results. So just explaining the development trap, we'll be talking, Simona will be talking more about that in the plenary up next, but basically we check changes in GDP per head, productivity and employment rates, and we compare the performance of the region to the EU, the country, and the region in the past. And so they get a score out of 1 to 9 if they're below average, and then you're in a trap in a particular year if your score is above 5. And you can also check the depth of the trap to see how far you are from the performance of those other regions, other geographic levels. We've only started the analysis, but the initial results definitely show that if you're trapped today, you're more likely to vote Eurosceptic. If you have been trapped for a longer period of time, you're even more likely to vote in Eurosceptic. And if the depth of that trap is if you're really far away from the performance of the country or the EU or your own region in the past, again, far more likely to vote Eurosceptic. So this is really a cumulative effect. The longer you're trapped, the more you get these kind of protest votes. Now, I want to give you a quick overview of what we've looked at in the past. Here, the colors are a little bit bleached, but it's okay. Purple means above EU average, green means below, and these were for the elections between 2013 and 2018. And you can clearly see that, especially when you go to moderate, you know, Greece, Italy, Hungary, and at the time, the UK, very, very high share. Purple, deep purple means over 50% anti-EU voting. Here, this is the breakdown by member state. We'll happily share the presentations, so I won't dwell on this too long, but you can see here, back then, it was Denmark, Austria, France, and Italy who had the highest share of at least opposition and plus strong opposition. Now, what have we figured out? What have we learned? We can see that low employment rates, low shares of tertiary education, low shares of young people, low densities, low turnout, low economic growth, and a shrinking share of industrial employment all contribute to higher Eurosceptic voting. We have some surprising results. Regions with a higher GDP tend to be more Eurosceptic when controlling for other factors. And this is, we primarily explain this because of the development trap. These are middle income regions that have declined. So they're not desperately poor, but they used to be richer relative to the rest of the country. And that generates worries, concerns about the future. And also, as you know, when that relative decline continues for a very long time, people become desperate and vote for any party that promised them a simple solution to a complex problem. Road performance, if that's good, it also tends to perform better. Employment growth, surprisingly, in some of the specifications contributes, and population change was very variable. There's also an urban-rural dimension. This is work that we've done together with Nicola, so he's gladly happy to answer all the difficult questions that I'll get at the end. But before I go into the electoral results, I want to emphasize that this is very much mirroring general perceptions. In most member states, the share of people in the EU, in that country, who say that they trust the EU is lower in rural areas. You know, the green dots are typically quite a few percentage points between the blue triangle, which are the cities. And this is quite surprising. Cohesion policy spends a lot of money in rural regions, more so than in urban regions. We've got agricultural policy, exclusive competence of the EU, again, a third of the budget going to that sector. And nevertheless, we see a lower level of trust in those rural areas. And so if we look at the vote share for parties opposed to EU integration, typically you see the green rural areas is above that in cities. So the green is above the blue, showing that more people in rural areas vote for Eurosceptic parties. If we look at it by degree of urbanization, what we've been using so far, you can see cities have a share for Eurosceptic parties that's 5 percentage points lower than rural areas and 4 percentage points lower than towns and suburbs. So clearly there's a difference there, even after taking into account a variety of factors. So these are the indicators we check by degree of urbanization. Declining GDP doesn't affect cities, or at least not significantly, or towns and suburbs, but really affects rural areas. Increasing unemployment increases the Eurosceptic vote everywhere. Tertiary education doesn't seem to matter in cities, but it does matter where it's lower in towns and suburbs and rural areas. And higher share, reduces the anti-Eurosceptic voting. Migrants, this for me is very interesting to see that having more people from a different EU member states in your area tends to reduce Eurosceptic voting, whereas having more people born outside the EU increases Eurosceptic voting. Now, for me, as somebody who works for the EU, this is freedom of movement, which we guarantee. This is national competence. So it's kind of strange that they, the one bit of migration we have nothing to say about leads to more Eurosceptic voting. Age is also interesting. We've got this, I call them middle-aged because I belong to that category. The middle-aged boost Eurosceptic voting in towns and suburbs and rural areas, whereas in the old only boost it in cities. Density tends to reduce it, and higher vote turnout also tends to reduce it. We try to look at what explains this, and we see that the biggest effect is the country effect. Some countries are very low, some countries are very high, so you need to factor that in. But the second big effect is economic variables, especially in rural areas. Declining GDP matters for rural areas. Sociodemographics matters more for towns and suburbs, and electoral variables, turnout, matters more in cities. So wanted to dwell a little bit on this point here. Higher GDP, why does that promote anti-EU voting? We definitely have the middle income traps, and that captures that palpable frustration that, there used to be job growth, income growth, this used to be an affluent place. Why are we no longer there? And given the longer it takes this relative decline, the more people get the impression that politically they don't matter, right? Their voices are not being heard. And you can find that in surveys as well, that also lots of people say that their voice doesn't matter in national or EU politics. But we also see Eurosceptic voting in very affluent parts. Think of the Netherlands, also the UK at the time, Denmark, Sweden. They're not in relative decline, but maybe they're so confident that their region is so good, their country is so good, that they don't think they need the EU, right? Their transport infrastructure might be very good. They think that they could go it alone, and some can easily be persuaded that they should go it alone and that they'll be better off. I tend to disagree with that point of view, but I want to emphasize that higher GDP, it's not just about the middle income trap. It's also about this very high level of confidence, borderline hubris. We've looked at cohesion policy together with Andres, and I was worried. I didn't want to ask, we've spent 350 billion, has this increased votes for anti-EU parties? Because I was terrified of what the result was going to be. Fortunately, we reduce Eurosceptic voting. Now, let me be clear, that's not the goal of my policy, right? Cohesion policy's goal is not to affect electoral results, but it would be kind of disconcerting if some of the places which received a lot of funding, like Wales or Cornwall, ended up voting quite Eurosceptically. So how does cohesion policy affect Eurosceptic voting? It can vote direct, if they're aware, right? You need to know that there's projects funded by cohesion policy before it influences your opinion directly. If you dislike the projects, you might actually think the EU is a waste of time. And the difficulty is we don't fund a lot in more developed regions. You know, cohesion policy spends very little in Denmark or Sweden. So cohesion policy cannot fix Euroscepticism in Sweden, right? It could also have an indirect effect. If cohesion policy, as our evaluations suggest, really improves quality of life, working conditions, then that might generate a more positive outlook on life and also influence the opinion of the EU. But of course, other impacts are also very important, notably the crisis, I've already mentioned it, but also the response to the crisis, austerity, the migration crisis, now the COVID crisis. All these things have an influence on how people look at cohesion policy. Here we can see how many are aware of EU support. And here you get the main recipients of cohesion policy. And here you get the countries that don't receive a lot. And obviously support is well, awareness is much higher where aid intensities are higher, right? So this is clear that spending a lot is noticed, not spending a lot, you know, very few people actually notice. So trying to look at what inside cohesion policy matters most is a bit complicated, but we have three funds: social fund, cohesion fund, regional development fund. All three reduce Euroscepticism, both strong and moderate opposition, so that's all good news. We looked at two programming periods, both of them reduced Euroscepticism. Investments in transport, tourism and culture, and urban and rural regeneration, we didn't really find a significant impact. Doesn't mean these are not a good idea, but it just means that we didn't find they had an impact on electoral output. Investments in human resources, RTD, and social infrastructure tend to reduce Eurosceptic voting, and more investments are linked to more Eurosceptic voting. So some of these at the level that you have them are good, but if you increase them, they reduce the effectiveness. But social infrastructure is the best one. If you have a high share and a high level, you get a double reduction, basically. So that's what I tried to explain here. But so, you know, what to remember is social infrastructure, both as a share of investment and as the total amount of investment, is mostly linked to less Eurosceptic voting. Now, wrapping up, what can we do, right? We've seen Eurosceptic voting is in an all-time high. Even strong opposition to the EU is increasing again in the latest elections. I think using Hirschman's framework, I don't want to promote exit, right? So I want to promote voice Agency, well, loyalty is the other one, but I want to promote voice and the sense of agency. So when people feel their voice doesn't matter, they are less likely to vote. If you think it doesn't matter, they don't care about us, voting tendencies go down. And the ones that do vote tend to protest vote. They've tried everything. They've voted every reasonable party. Now I'm going to try a party that's considered a little bit extreme. And so that's why it goes up. Now, the EU is a strange animal. We're not really an international organization. We're not really a government. We're something in between that we barely know how to explain. And it's quite distant, right? Brussels is easy to blame, but it's difficult for us to engage, especially with local stakeholders. But there are a couple of things that I think may help. We've got this European Citizens Initiative. Lots of people can get together and put something on the agenda. And also in the long-term vision for rural areas, there's a real genuine attempt to get the voice of rural areas recognized, to engage with those stakeholders, to understand why they don't trust the EU, why they're worried about the future, and what we can do about it. Loss of agency, that's not a good thing. I would say it would argue that leads to more extreme voting. Boosting public investment can help, as you see with cohesion policy. It improves their quality of life and their economic development. Also community-led local development. We had a presentation on that earlier today. May increase the sense of voice and agency, and I think that's really important. Then those high GDP regions, I talked about their confidence, or if you will, hubris. And I think it's very dangerous if a lot of affluent countries and regions start to think that they don't need the EU, right? We're a needless obstacle. And I think we need to really communicate what we are, why we're doing it, and why they can't do that alone, right? If we want to be rule makers, we have to unite, because individual member states are going to be by default rule takers. And I think this was also the illusion that the whole Brexit referendum was steeped in, that the UK could make their own rules. But as a small economy outside a large bloc that, votes united, there's no way that UK is going to be a rule maker. It's going to be a rule taker. And so that's important also for Denmark, Sweden, the Netherlands, France, Italy to understand. I also think we need to say what we are. And I think the easiest way to communicate what the EU is that we're a very, very small international government. We're not an international organization. We have a parliament. We have lots of elements that you could recognize. We have a council. We have a commission, which is a horrible term. I always feel like I work for the commission, it's like the firm, or like I'm some bad guy in a bad movie. But if we can sell simply, we're uniting to make sure that we can do things we can't do alone. All the rest you can still do yourself. I mean, maybe that helps. But of course, decision making is slow and very complex and difficult to explain. Nicola shared a paper demonstrating quantitatively that our press releases are the most jargon-filled ever. And it's true. It's true. And that's how we lose people's support, right? Nativism. This is also a tricky one. We've seen in some countries that an increase in the number of foreign-born has boosted Eurosceptic vote. We see that more people born outside the EU boost Eurosceptic voting. So we need to think about how we can manage that. Austerity, reduction of services, culture wars, and our scapegoat role. Governments can come to the council, support something, go home and say, look what Brussels is making us do, right? This helps in the short term, but we pay the price in the medium and the long term. So wrapping up, what can we do? We can try and listen and involve and invest more, particularly in rural regions and those in a middle income trap. We can boost growth, reduce unemployment, increase education, again, especially in those in decline in rural areas. More roads is not the answer. Typically, more roads is never the answer, but not everybody agrees with that. Some people really love asphalt, but what can I say? Better economic integration, better services, investing, especially in poor regions to promote convergence and cohesion, I think will all help the cause. Now, this is the toughest one. I think Brexit has helped to reduce support for hardline Euroscepticism, but I don't think it's enough. And we need to have that clear narrative and contest the scapegoat role. And then last but not least, we are our own worst enemy in the sense that the EU cannot sell what it does. If I say the EU is awesome, people won't believe me because I work for the EU. But if somebody who doesn't work for the EU, like a prime minister, says the EU has done this and this and that for us, that person has far more credibility. Right now, some governments are not really using that credibility in a way that's very supportive of the EU. Other countries have not really called them out on that, but at a certain point, you are creating a very dangerous environment politically. So that's it. Thank you for listening. These are the papers. I'm happy to answer questions.
Okay, let's take, yes, 3, 4, too many, right? So now we leave also for the discussion at the end, because I mean the topic is that. Okay? So 1, 2, and there was another there, or you. Yes, okay, the 3 of you, and then we'll move on.
Hi, you don't have to be apologetic. The EU is awesome, and it is awesome because it was created in order to create cohesion after the war, and we shouldn't forget that. With this said, three things as questions and food for thought. The first is, in your way of speaking and analyzing, you're saying this region is voting this and that, but it's not the region. It's people that are voting, and they're in a certain context, and it's changing a lot. So there is a lot of literature now going, and obviously Andres is more than familiar with it, people and places left behind and how this interacts. The second thing is, when you had some kind of contradiction. You were saying about this investment in agriculture, but then these areas not sort of speaking back about it. And here comes the question, what do these people know when they're voting anti, how much they have as information? So again, the analysis has to be on individual level. And the third thing, when you were terrified about the analysis of cohesion, well, actually you shouldn't, because the question here is not causal. The question is what people acknowledge from what is done from the Commission. It's again, you're understanding their response. So it's a question of salience. And this which you were showing there with the roads, it's again, this is something which is obvious. That's why they voted for it. And I guess with this I'll wrap.
I'm going to agree. Or should we take the others? Let's take the other two.
Let's take the other two there.
Mikko Wegrud from the Institute of Natural Resources. I have a bit similar question than the previous, but I'll formulate it maybe in a different way. I have a kind of more critical question and then more constructive. Which one you want first?
Critical.
Okay. Well, in resemblance to the previous, how much do you actually know the motivation of the people who vote for the anti-EU, and why do they vote these specific parties? Because it might be something else. It's very complex, like a lack of political efficacy, overall distrust, maybe just to conservatism. And this might be a problem for somebody who likes to understand the phenomena, if he has a wrong dependent variable. That's my first one. And then the second one is that, of course, we would like to know what is the effect of the EU on the attitudes of individuals. But I think, if I understood correctly, you did kind of individual level, linking the awareness of, no, it was a regional level, multi-level analysis. And you had the data on the different kind of EU funding, and that has a contextual effect to the individual. Okay, then I withdraw my second question. Thanks.
Yes, Michael Kohl from the same Natural Resources Institute, Finland. A simple question, a little bit complex introduction maybe, but I'm a countryside. Short, yes, very simple, yes. And that is just related because I'm engaged in the evaluation of the LEADER program in Finland, and which is an impressive participatory process overall. So my simple question is because you have done this interrelationship of cohesion policy and Euroscepticism, is there anything about the CAP or rural development policy and Euroscepticism? That was my simple question. Thank you.
I'll be very telegraphic. So basically, I'm going to agree that indeed I should talk about regions because regions don't vote. I should talk about people. And the thing that is difficult is this type of analysis, you basically have two branches which struggle to talk to each other, right? In the analysis I showed you, we analyzed 60,000 constituencies. And so we get a high level of spatial resolution, but at the expense of not having microdata, right? So we don't know why people voted in a particular way. We don't know if they themselves are aware of EU projects and whether they like them or not, because to do so, you know, we would have to consult. If you want to get that result for 60,000 constituencies, you need 1,000 people in each constituency. I would need, you know, 60 million respondents, but you can do it for individual, you know, you can do focus groups and work in that kind of way here, but then you lose the spatial perspective, right? The benefit here is you get the richness of the spatial perspective, but you lose the individual perspective.
It's absolutely understandable. Just when you're analyzing it, you shouldn't blame so
True.
much
The region. Yeah, no, and the one thing that is difficult out of this research is to understand the salience of the EU. I mean, some people might vote for the party because their brother is in it or their uncle, and they have no opinion whatsoever about the EU. So it's a difficult proxy, but here we've looked at whether they have made this part of their political party. So these.
A lot of voting, but 40% is about what is rational and 60% is about emotions. Yeah. So then this is a lot going along the idea if you think about awareness. Maybe there's a lot about awareness in the opinion that has to be done more.
So I think I've answered your question as well. Help me out with your question. It was leader, common agricultural policy. I have done no analysis of the impact of that. I just like the community-led local development aspect, which really helps to give that voice. But I just emphasize that we spend a lot of money through the agricultural policy, rural development, cohesion policy in rural regions, and that nevertheless, you know, we still see a general tendency of lower trust and more voting for Eurosceptic parties there. But definitely ample opportunity for more research, and we have more people to talk about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we got another line.
Okay. No.
1 second.
Try again.
I don't think.
This is the second to the third. Okay, okay. Go ahead. Okay, that's one. Okay. Thank you for being here. First of all, this is a joint work together with Maria Cecchina, that she's here, and she will speak after me. Liliana Cucco from the PhD student, also like Maria, the University of Verona, Liliana, the University of Barcelona. And we try to understand a bit more about left behind places and political discontent. In particular, how people are going to express their political discontent, and trying to understand if they are going to blame parties which are against national institutions or against supranational institutions, let's say the EU. So the first thing to be stressed is something that Luis already, these three presentations are quite complementary, so I think I can skip more or something. However, what's the channel? One of the channels because of people is against the establishment, being it national or external establishment, is the feeling of being left behind. So lowering trust on institutions and traditional parties, and then supporting for populist party. The point is that traditional parties were not able to improve my life, to my life standards. Then I can try to
vote for others. So the populist movements then, they are something like exploiting the feeling of marginalization, and they are playing both with objective and perceived economic decline in a way. So they are able to exploit really well the situation in both terms. We are going to exploit a particular case, Italy, because Italy is characterized, we will see in a moment, by a very peculiar situation. So in 2018 elections, parties that were strongly anti-EU were not strongly anti-elite, and vice versa. And we read this phenomenon as being anti-elite, as blaming within institutions and elites within the country, while blaming voting for anti-EU parties, like blaming parties outside, institutions outside the country. So this is quite interesting, because in Italy, we see, first of all, that just to give you a picture of what is happening, this is the trust from Eurobarometer related on EU and government. We see that both of them are decreasing, and in particular, anti-EU, this is, here we can see the debt crisis around here. And then we see a jump on the top on regarding EU trust, but however, we see that the trends for both anti-EU and internal Italian government trust are going to are declining in both cases. So we are going then to use data at not at regional this time level, but at municipal level for Italy, labeling the parties that are anti-EU as those that score less than 2.5, while populist parties, those that are higher value than 7.5, both these values are taken from the Japanese expert survey, like Lewis illustrated before. So the difference between this presentation and the presentation of Lewis is that we are considering two aspects, which are these one. So here you can see that the populist vote and the populist anti-elite and the anti-EU vote are correlated at minus 0.5. And in the north, there is a concentration for anti-EU vote, while in the south, center-south, for populist vote. This is the cartogram that shows you the size of the municipalities in terms of population, because the risk is, if we look only at the left-hand side map, giving too much weight according to the shape, to the size of municipalities that do not correspond to the population. So in this case, for example, we see Rome in the center, okay? And or Turin, we see here that some cities pops up a bit compared to the surroundings, like we have Turin, Milan, etc., etc. Another way of seeing the same data, I don't know why here we see pieces. Well, that's a mystery, however, is this. So we see again the shared discontent in terms of anti-EU vote is concentrated in the north, while in the south for anti-elite. So the culprit is external institution and internal institution. Okay, now let's go to the second step, define the definition of the lagging behind area. I have to say, thanks to Simona, etc., because we borrow some things from the middle income trap regions, but exploiting and try to looking at it, at this framework from a national perspective. So we guess that left behind places is left behind places if it is lagging behind with respect to some benchmarks. The benchmarks are the neighbors, the region, and the country, with respect to three key economic variables: population, employment to population, and GDP per capita. So one person could say to the better the dynamics of these three indicators. Someone can say that this strategy has many limits. Could be. The point is that we try to keep as much simple as we can to try to define something meaningful and that could be reproduced in Italian and in other contexts around Europe. Okay, so we follow a bit again the regional development trap DMAR all 2022, considering the dynamics of these variables, and for between 2013 and 2018. Why? Because 5 years, it's written in the paper, is quite a reasonable time lag. And furthermore, in 2013, we had election, and 2018. So it fits perfectly. So here some justification about the choice of the variables. Let's start for GDP. It's a regional synthetic measure of regional welfare. We borrow a bit from some authors that shows that unemployment is one of the key variables affecting the likelihood of voting against, in particular for anti-EU parties in Greece and Austria, but also for the middle income trap, from the middle income trap paper that justifies very well why employment to population is a good measure for analyzing this type of things. We took also population for one reason. In Italy, we have a problem with the population, in particular on internal areas. And we have some papers that shows that there are links between the economic condition and the population dynamics. So we have Alvarez, Diaz, we have Rizzo that shows that the development in terms of population in Italy is strictly related, and also reflect the spatial heterogeneity in the population rates. So then let's go to the second step after the choice of the variables, the benchmark. The benchmark are neighbors, regions, country. So the idea is if my municipality is underperforming dynamically with respect to neighbors, we attach the value 0.5. If with respect to region, 0.333333, country 0.16. And why do we attach these weights? So the point is, we feel that due to the spillovers, is very bad in economic and social terms, being lagging behind with respect to the neighbors. So if you are lagging behind with respect to the neighbors, really there is something that is not working. Okay, so we give a lot of weight to these dimension, okay, and lower weight to the other ones. So basically what do we have is something like this, okay, a matrix where a municipality can take these values for these dimension, for these variables. Then we had to choose our bench, okay, we have the matrix. Now, how do we define the lagging behind areas? Two criteria. The criteria is that we assign to each row the sum of weights if it is equal to at least 0.5. How it can be equal to 0.5? Each row, simply because it's lagging behind with respect to the neighbors, or this is 6, 6, 6, 6, 3, 3, 3, 3, or because it's lagging behind with respect to at least both. Okay, so we have basically, I'll go back in a second. We have basically out of the 8 possible combination by row, in 4 out of 5, the municipality has to be lagging behind with respect to the neighbors. Okay, so we are going to attach a very, very strong weight to the neighbors because of the spillover, etc., etc. This condition must hold for each line, for each one of our 3 variables. Then in the second step, we sum up the values of the rows, and we classify a place left behind as left behind if the sum is equal at least to 2. which means that the majority, at least 5 or out of 9 external benchmarks should be satisfied. Let's see these in this quick slide. For can I be? So I have to stop here. Yes. No. The micro. Okay, so I don't know if you can hear, however, in this case, we have that in one row, it's below 0.5. Then this could not be a left behind place. Here we have that in all row is at least 2.5, is at least 0.5, but the summation is below 2, then this is not a left behind place. In this case, instead, we have that for each row, we have at least 0.5 and the summation is at least 2. So this is a left behind place. And then for this case. So let's jump to the results. Before I show you, these are the left behind places. We give the values according to the strength. I don't know why you cannot see very well the map. However, what I can say you is that there is no spatial autocorrelation. So they are very random in space. And then we can see some variables. We can see that the share of people in left behind places in Italy, according to our definition, is around 40%. We see that for populist votes, there is a very small difference, while for anti-EU vote, there is quite a strong difference, comparatively stronger. We see some other things that could be interesting. Is a matter of, if we look at some economic variables, we see that in left behind places, we have a higher Gini, employment in manufacturing, employment in agriculture. And then let's go to our empirical model, which is a standard model with the left-hand side variable could be discontent, which means voting, the share of vote for anti-EU parties or for populist party, populist anti-elite parties, a set of control variable, and our left behind place. Some quick results. First, we can read these results by row. Why? Because, for example, we see that urban areas have a different impact with respect to populist and anti-EU parties. So we see that some variables tend to have completely different sign and significance. Other are just significant for one or the other. Like, for example, cost, we have the beaches concession in Italy, that's a matter of trouble for people, etc., etc. So the share of household with no internet, we see that it's quite interesting because they tend to vote for populist parties, while not for anti-elite parties. In this case, it's probably the share of information or there are many different ways of reading these results. One is that these areas tend to be poorer, and these poorer area tend to blame anti-elite internal. Yes, I'm going to finish in a while. They tend to blame for internal actors rather than external. Why fake news, where they circulate, then it's the contrary. So share of migrants, surprisingly, is not significant. Employment rate is negative for populist anti-EU parties, and we see that typically economic variables affect anti-elite parties. People in municipalities with bad economic condition tend to blame for the internal elite. The low and high educated people is exactly the contrary. So low educated people tend to vote for anti-EU while not for anti-elite, and vice versa. And then let's go to our key variable. So left behind places, we treat it as a dummy or as an intensity. We see that is highly correlated with anti-EU parties. So people living in left behind places tend to blame external actors rather than internal actor. I'm going to finish with some few slides. If we make an interaction between geographical area in Italy and our dummies, we see that the problem is related to the north. In the north, people are living in left behind places are blaming populist anti-EU parties. This is something like they were not used to live in this area. Some considerations. So in Italy in 2008, the two types of feeling were somewhat alternative, with a very clear geographical pattern, as we have seen from the map. There are quite different factors behind the vote for populist and anti-elite and for populist anti-EU parties. And I would go directly to some conclusion related to the left behind places. So according to us, this type of results should help in the allocation of policies and structural funds, in the sense that the structural funds until now they are located looking at statical indicators. Even if we take the internal area strategy in Italy, this strategy is developed on the base on the distance from the urban centers. So it's not considering this dynamic dimension. So if we want to avoid political discontent and anti-EU vote, we have to take another perspective. The perspective should be more dynamic and comparative, because we are going to see, we saw that the most important factors are the neighbors, as I stressed before. Then these should be the way of dealing with policies and funds allocation. And I think that's all.
Question 1, 2. Yes, please.
Hi, Nicola. Very interesting, this distinction between elite and EU voting. Something similar might be interesting about going to the right or going to the left when you're, but I was thinking something very small, technical. You take into account employment or unemployment, sort of. Yeah, and this is very, very relevant. But I was wondering, did you see something about the long-term unemployment? Because Luis was saying this about regions, longer-term unemployment or decline.
We don't have data at municipal level about this. So we use what we have basically. So it's not easy. Even to reconstruct GDP per capita, we went to the declaration of rents, and then we reallocated the gross value added at provincial level according to the declaration of rents in each municipality. So we have some limitations. And so unfortunately, I cannot go so far.
I see. I thought that for the long-term unemployed, there is some data about the, neither in education nor in...
I'll check, however. If you think so, probably it's there.
Maybe
It's worth trying.
Here.
Hi, it's Francesco Prota from University of Bari. I have to be honest, I have some problem with this classification, anti-EU or anti-elite.
We're on time.
In the sense that, I mean, the way in which these parties are defined anti-EU or anti-elite, I mean, comes from
the Chapelli Extra survey.
Okay. But are you sure that people voting for this party perceive them as anti-EU or anti-elite? I don't think so, I have to be honest. Even because I'm closing, even because EU is perceived as elite. So if I vote for a party anti-elite, it's likely that I'm voting for a party anti-EU. This is my...
There is different club that is elite for reason. So those in the north might perceive the EU as an elite that they're voting against, and then those in the south might be voting against the local elite, but it's always a distinction, which cannot be bothering.
And
I have some. I have some
yes, I think that this is the general problem when you have to vote. You vote depends, no? You don't vote just a party because of this. Probably many Italians are voting some parties because they want to go in pension. This is always in the electoral campaign, a hot topic, no? So you can, however, you can classify. What you could do is try to classify according to other criteria, manifesto project, for example. Because but however, you vote for a package. So we cannot distinguish. We cannot really distinguish if we want to use objective data at territorial level. So we cannot go too far in this extent. Sorry? Disease. No, this is the idea. We collect the data from the Ministry of Interior regarding votes at municipal level. So, yeah, this is a problem that is for all the studies about political discontent, I think. And you know what? The advantage of using this data is that this is an objective data. It's not a perception data. So if you have a perception, it's come on, you can cheat. You can worry about who is doing you the question, what could think, etc., etc. So there is this trade-off in this type of analysis, I may say.
Thank you very much. Maria.
Good afternoon. My name is Maria Cecchina, and I'm a first-year PhD student in the University of Verona. And today I'm going to present you the research that was part of my master thesis made with Nicola Pontarollo, that is focused on the premises of political discontent across Italian territories. Understanding the geography and nature of political discontent remains challenging so far due to the complexity of phenomena and variety of different factors that make people vote against. In this way, Italy is an interesting case study thanks to the tendency for political radicalization and deep territorial inequalities that go beyond the historical North-South divide. I will avoid repeating some theoretical insights and will move to the point. A significant body of literature has tried to understand the range of factors that contribute to the emergence of political discontent and regional inequality as a primary driver of discontent is an outcome of multiple disadvantaged conditions that is undermined by first nature and second nature geography. That means that places that have some geographical advantages in terms of efficiency or transportation costs tend to show higher economic growth. On the other hand, the places that have the decrease in financial performance can be demobilized, while deprivation has a mobilizing effect over time. In addition, social capital can enhance the capacity of society to cooperate and fosters productivity. As a previous presentation, the study focuses on the two most prevalent in recent years variations of populism in Italy, anti-elitist or pure populist and Eurosceptic voting. The study examines the outcomes of the 2018 elections on the Italian Chamber of Deputies, and the data is also available on the municipal level. And classification of parties is provided by Chapel Hill Expert Survey. The number of parties analyzed for the 2018 was equal to 8, and it's important to note that no party under the selected filtering score had attributes of both anti-elitist or Eurosceptic movements. And taking into account that voting behavior might be affected by some location-specific factors that reflect common history, background, and shared values, the spatial econometric techniques were introduced in the research methodology. For example, Moran's eye was used in order to identify the presence of spatial dependencies across the regions. And the cluster maps on the slide represent the significant locations with the indication of the type of spatial autocorrelation. Regions with relatively high Eurosceptic voting is located in the north of Italy, while prevalence of pure populist voting can be found in the south of the country. To evaluate the factors that drive the geography of political discontent, the study contrasts the outcomes of the linear regression with fixed regional effects with the spatial autoregressive model with fixed regional effects. And the dependent variable discontent is alternatively the share of Eurosceptic or pure populist voting, while the independent variables are represented as groups of factors, the vector of geographic, economic, and social capital variables. In addition, we provide an analysis of 3 separate samples, the central, south, and north of Italy. So I move to the results. I will introduce the variables in groups. However, the estimations reflect the complete specification of the model, and on the slide you can see the raw term that suggests that the variation in discontent voting can be explained at least 50% in variation in discontent voting can be explained by spatial association. And unfortunately, you don't see the colors, but ragness is reported to be associated with the increase in Eurosceptic sentiment and decrease in the populist one. The tendency, the ragness is a variation in elevation. It's a okay.
Data of 450 kilometers, and basically the higher, if there is a variance, high variance in the mountains, basically. Yeah, okay. Average altitude is on this region. Okay. It means that they are higher.
But does this thing have a pointer in case?
It has a laser.
Oh, okay. Okay, the tendency is stable over the regions that suggests that one possible explanation for this can be the relative apartness of places due to geographic obstacles that complicates the informational exchange, especially on the level of supranational decisions. On the other hand, we can see that the level of urbanization is associated with the increase in populist sentiment. Such a result contradicts some literature arguing for the positive effects of the higher density on the content levels, and the observed relationship can be an outcome of the growing economic gap, especially represented in the large cities. What is interesting is that in both spatial autoregression model and linear regression, the coastal location is associated with Eurosceptic sentiment. As already Nicola told us, it can be the result of the European directives aimed to relocate beach concessions through tender procedures that have threatened local businesses with free competition. Unfortunately, the variations for the location of the municipality near the seaside doesn't provide stable results, so we can't interpret it really well. The level of inequality and unemployment tend to rise populist sentiments, and it's quite obvious. However, here in the north, you can see that negative estimates can be the consequence of withdrawal hypothesis when some individuals, due to the disadvantaged social position, and economic uncertainty lack trust and tend to see no link between political engagement and potential benefits. The positive change in value added is associated with the decrease in discontent voting, and a relative improvement in well-being keeps individuals content. However, the positive estimates for the absolute amount of value added can highlight the possible trend of Western countries for neo-protectionism alongside with the increased integration, have grown perceptions about market vulnerability and risks associated with openness. Next variables represent the structure of economy. Here an interesting result is that construction sector is associated with an increase in Eurosceptic voting. The sector is subjected to the numerous European incentives and directives regarding waste, professional qualification, safety, and technical requirements. As for manufacturing sector, we suppose that automatization and innovation might enhance discontent among low-skilled workers who can potentially lose their job and be substituted by technologically advanced machines. The age structure as well as the level of education confirms the general image of a discontent individual who is described as a middle-aged and low-educated person. However, here we can see that the discontent of low-educated person is mostly directed towards European Union. The share of immigrants is associated with the increase in Eurosceptic sentiment, and it's quite obvious due to the fact that immigration inflows are concentrated in the north and south of Italy. What is really interesting is the percentage of recycling and access to recycling sites is associated with an increase in populist sentiment. We suppose that for people with disadvantaged economic and social position, their own future might seem challenging, while the requirement to think about the future of the planet and next generation irrelevant and even humiliating. As for Eurosceptic clusters, the availability of public services might enhance trust towards institutions on the other hand. And finally, turnout is associated with the decrease in discontent sentiments. It suggests that newly engaged individuals would rather vote for parties different from anti-system ones. To conclude, I would like to say that the design and application of the place-based policies can enhance sustainable development and address disparities that, in case of Italy, result in populist and Eurosceptic sentiment. And in the regions with the high Eurosceptic voting, it's important mostly the proper communication and explanation of the policies implemented and their justification, while in the municipalities with predominance of pure populist sentiment, of course, the proper decisions should be taken to adjust the level of inequality and unemployment, but also if introduction of practices that somewhat obligate people to follow certain rules are performed, it should be rewarded or introduced gradually, since it can be perceived an additional challenge for existing disadvantaged position. Thank you.
Stop this. Well, this is very interesting and complementary. So questions for Maria? I have one, actually. I didn't understand why you, I think. Yeah, yes, of course, for the words, yeah, right. Sorry, okay. Doesn't work. Speak to the, yeah, yeah. No, I didn't understand why you put this social capital, because beyond the turnout, I didn't see. Be better here because I'm not the speaker, but I didn't see really social capital variables, and I am worried about it because more and more social capital is measured by friends on Facebook. That is something that worries me really seriously. So, I mean, there is a strong and, ancient theory of social capital and differentiation theoretically. So what is your concept behind?
So we refer to the social capital as a potential of the human capital and cultural and social values. For example, here in the research, we do not show, but we also tried to measure somewhat solidarity, but it didn't really provide stable results, introducing such a variable as a presence of the association for the organ donation in the municipality as a, let's say, voluntary will of people to help each other. So we suppose that, first of all, education and, let's say, social responsibility, since we refer to the percentage of recycling as a kind of proxy of social responsibility, is a part of social capital in this case.
If I can give you an advice, I would more maybe leave it on the cultural side.
Yes,
than
we
social
also
capital,
introduced,
because it's something that matters a lot, in my opinion, but I would define in a different way, participation in churches, trade unions, political parties, activism, all these sort of things that are completely discarded nowadays.
no, actually.
So, Louis, yeah.
If I just can add, we introduced the variable, I didn't talk about it because, can I somehow return? Okay. The cultural amenities, yes. The presence of cultural amenities that was churches, libraries, theaters, and unfortunately doesn't provide stable results over different specification of the model. That's yes, we tried.
Yeah.
Okay.
So my comment is on the access to services. Some people hate recycling, so maybe maybe this is just a good thing to test. But when I think of public services that might be important at the local level, primary school is one of the first ones I think about. And Marco Di Cataldo, professor at the University of Venice, I think, used data from the closing of primary schools. So from 2010 to 2019. So it covers this period. And so you could check both whether the proximity to a primary school or the closing of a primary school would actually have an impact. And arguably that would be a service. Okay, it's not, doesn't concern everybody like recycling, but it's a service that has a stronger, say, local component.
Yes, actually, recycling has also an application as so-called not in my backyard. So some people are just not happy about it. But yes, thank you for your comment. So I think we will consider it in the future.
Any other comments, thoughts from the audience? I found very interesting across the presentation this low education factor that comes, and an elderly age or middle age, actually, because this makes me think of Brexit a lot. And as a European that leaves the UK and actually is leaving the UK for Brexit reasons. But it was interesting because right after Brexit, I brought my students of the course of political economy of the European integration to the office of the European Parliament in London, that then was obviously shut. And there were really very, very interesting and, committed people that showed us what was the most Googled question the day after the referendum in the UK. That was, it was more than 1 million people. What is the European Union? It's true. So this is yeah, but we have Europe as a concept, so that is was a very good move. And he did campaign. Oh yeah. March the law. Yes, but Italy is on the brink, so let's see what happens. Right, it was really inspiring and also very much, in line with the 3 presentations. So I would like to thank again the 3 presenters. And now we can have a slightly longer break. That is my phone. I don't know how to stop this time, but anyway.